I'd like to once again welcome you to our EPIIC Future of Middle East and North Africa Symposium. I'm Abuzar, Royesh, and I'm a member of EPIIC 2014. And now I have the pleasure to introduce to you Professor Elizabeth Thompson. Professor Thompson is currently an associate professor of history at the University of Virginia. She is also a distinguished author. Her first book, Colonial Citizens, Republican Rights, Paternal Privileges, Gender and Frontier in Lebanon, won national prizes from the American Historical Association and the Berkshire Conference of Women Historians. Professor Thompson has also won numerous other awards from the Carnegie Corporation of New York, the American Council of Learned Societies, the Social Science Research Council, the U.S. Institute of Peace, the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, and the Library of Congress. Among the highlights of our EPIIC class last semester was to read her book, Justice Interrupted, The Struggle for Constitutional Government in the Middle East. This book invites us to rethink the concept of justice, especially in the Middle Eastern context. In her book, she takes us on a journey from Mustafa Ali under Ottoman Empire to Hassan Banna in Egypt and Dr. Ali Shariati in Iran. Telling these stories, she shows us that the current events of Arab Spring are not, as many in the West claim, an Arab introduction to democracy, because constitutionalism has much deeper roots in the region. Justice Interrupted offers us with the perspective of people who struggle for justice against tyranny and inequality. Her book has been widely received by many in the public and political spheres. And tonight we are very lucky to have her here with us. And so please give it up for Professor Elizabeth Thompson.
Thank you so much for having me here. It's quite a pleasure and an honor to be a historian at a gathering like this. I'll start with an anecdote a little bit, and then we'll jump into World War I. Years ago, when writing that book, I took a fellowship at the U.S. Institute of Peace out in Washington, D.C. And I showed up, and I got my desk, and I got my computer, went down to the library, no history books. I said, and they said, oh, well, we set up the library in 1987. We decided history books were not necessary for our project of, solving conflict in the region. And I thought that was very depressing. So you've given me a little hope tonight. But it is a depressing subject. I come to you with, there we go, I love that. And that is the topic of World War I. I'm involved in, you wouldn't believe how many conferences marking the centennial of the war. But one of the more remarkable things about this war is that it's relatively unstudied and unknown, unremembered, and unaccounted for when we think about it. Think what, World War II and how it defines our understanding of Europe today, right? Think about, more appropriately, I think the comparison should be, think about how the Civil War in the United States has defined this country, has defined our political culture, has defined a history of racial politics that has underpinned much of other political history in this country, how much it is a touchstone to understanding the modern history of the United States. You begin to get an understanding of what World War I is for the peoples of the Middle East. I'm going to give you a very broad brush, but I'm going to actually, since I'm working on a particular paper, focus in on one particular legacy that I'm interested in right now and that I think pertains to your conference. But first, let's go through the very well-known and diverse legacies of World War I. I have pictures here on your left of the war at the Battle of Gallipoli, which the Turks would win, but they would lose Anatolia. They would lose their empire and retain only Anatolia at the end of the war. On your right is the flag raised of the Arab Revolt and the rebellion against the Ottomans after June 1916. Can you see that? Oh, good. Yes. Okay. The point being, as you've all had your textbook histories, you've read about the breakup of a multicultural, pluralistic empire into what was supposed to be nation states, but also, well, even more messy than the process undergone simultaneously by the Austrian and Austro-Hungarian Empire at the same time, producing, irregular borders, people left out of states, and so on. So that is one aspect of the war. Another legacy of the war is its total social cataclysm. All right, I give you just one of many pictures you can find of what happened to Armenians and the mass expulsions in 1915 from Anatolia, a product of the very fear of the collapse of empire, the fear on the part of Turks as much as Armenians, as much as Kurds, as much as Arabs, as much as Jews over in Europe, that they would be wiped off the face of the map and be annihilated. The word annihilation is used by all groups in this period. It was the Armenians, however, and their fate as they straggled across the border into Syria, down into Lebanon, all the way into Jerusalem, even into Egypt, and the stories they carried that put the bone-chilling fear in others' hearts as well. These are inform, I'm conscious that I'm talking to people that have many details about current history, and I want to some way express to you why it's worth paying attention for a moment. I think of history as sort of forming the biorhythms of the sort of almost unconscious or the deep conscious reference. You know, when I hear you give panels and people ask about tribalism, people ask about monarchy in its place, what is it that people are looking for? What I tried to get at in the book I wrote was that what World War I brought was the breaking of faith that one could have a polity ruled by law, including many peoples as equals. That had been the project of constitutional revolutions before the war. And I always get to the week on constitutional revolutions in my modern history class, and I get students who are surprised to learn that there have been such things, right? But that they are brought to their knees, and that those constitutional governments that had promised justice failed so miserably, failed to protect their people, and so a deep distrust of larger structures, I think, is one takeaway in thinking about the I have to say, yet unstudied legacies of World War I. One of the big projects, again, I go to Berlin, I go here and there, right, the new take on World War I in 2014 is, in fact, the integration of the Mediterranean, and particularly the Ottoman theater, into the general story, and seeing resonances, right? Not only were people murdered later, the Armenian expulsion and mass killings would be termed a genocide. People suffered mass famine in ways they had never done so before. Nearly 500,000 people in what was called Greater Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Israel, Jordan, died of hunger and the disease that came from that hunger, right? Just as 750,000 Germans did during the war due to the British blockade of the ports, primarily. There were errors of logistics of the Ottoman administration. There was the common sin committed by most armies, and not all armies in the war, of diverting the food away from civilians to soldiers and so on. But we're only now peeling away, and it's a credit to the Turkish government, in fact, that they are opening up their archives, and we're beginning to get a more precise picture of what it was to see a society collapse in hunger the year after seeing Armenians come and die on the roadside, and before that hearing tales of murder of their families and so on. All of this set up a process of more controlled, so to speak, ethnic cleansing, product of the lack of trust again, the population exchange between Greeks and Turks after the war, a grisly, awful process, and neglected by most Europeans afterward, poorly managed by NGOs and so on, that led to then a new norm of homogenized populations. But would those homogenized populations all get states? As you're going to hear, I guess, today, right after my talk, one of the longer legacies of the incomplete process and the painfully brutal process of the breakup of the empire was that not all peoples do get states, right? And that the Kurds were one of those. On your right, you have General Allenby walking into Jerusalem out of respect for the ancient city, bringing with him the Balfour Declaration, and I don't think in this audience I have to go into too much detail about both the promise of security that the Balfour Declaration would bring to Jewish people, but also the radical reconfiguring of the society of people who were living there until the British came in. And so another legacy of World War I, of course, is the continuing Arab-Israeli conflict that we confront today. Lest we believe the older histories that painted a very, well, not a rosy picture, but a positive picture of British rule in their empire. The British particularly loved to boast of how much better at empire they were than the French, and certainly than the Americans today. We've had some lessons in the last few years on that. And they, just as much as the French, who walked into and took control of the Arab portions of the Ottoman Empire after the war, did not have the money nor the interest to spend on the populations who have been devastated by the war. And we think of the Great Marshall Plan after World War II, we can point to a massive undertaking by European states whose populations were as prostrated by the war. But that would not happen here. It would take a decade for most of these countries to achieve pre-war levels of agricultural production. People remained hungry. They didn't have a shovel. They didn't have a horse, a donkey, nothing to farm with. That had all been requisitioned by the Ottoman army. And only slowly did they rebuild their lives. Most men, or not most, but large numbers of men never came home, leaving families destitute. Anatolia was called the land of the widows for much of the 1920s. So there is this profound sense of trauma only 100 years ago. And I just say that I teach at the University of Virginia. It's in the American South, and we still remember the Civil War, right, 150 years later. This is in, if you scratch beneath the surface, you get to this history, right? I've tried to do, and I've done my share of oral histories. It has helped me as a historian. It's a sort of reality check when you're finding things in the archive to go talk to people. But they have not, their parents didn't talk about it. They don't want to talk about it. It's embarrassing. It's traumatic. It is an untold history to be explored by historians who, I'm very proud to say, we've inspired a number of historians. I have a seminar with the National Endowment for Humanities, and we're running a seminar on the World War I in the Middle East. And we're planting the seeds of many new scholars and new courses to, teach the war. But the silence about the famine is the long silence by Armenians. Armenians don't really begin publishing their memoirs of what happened to them until after World War II. It's a bit akin, perhaps, to the very strange silence about the influenza pandemic of 1918-1919. Scholars still ponder why it is that nobody talked about it. Right? 50 million people died right after World War I around the globe, including in the Middle East, right? You don't get much talk. All right. Another familiar story is the story of national denial. There's Prince Faisal, King Faisal soon, at Paris, at the Paris Peace Talks with, there he is, Lawrence of Arabia by his side, and of course, story that is often told and repeated in textbooks, in the Arab world, of course, is his denial of the state by these officers of war on your right, and the chilling realization that people had in Europe, places you've never been or even imagined you could be, could determine your future as a people and polity at the stroke of a pen, despite all the suffering and sacrificing you felt you'd gone through in the war, added to the bitterness and the trauma already felt by populations. What I want to point to, though, today, and give you a little bit of a twist to a very familiar story, one you've been exposed to, that about the sort of deferred dreams of Arab nationalism that may emerge later, is to talk about another casualty that has much, and I'd love to hear from you, whether you feel there's any resonance in what I imagine are going to be many conversations about the Arab Spring at this conference. Here's the maps. There's the Ottoman Empire, split up into these countries. And here, I've lost it. The casualty I want to talk about is not the loss of a nation, not a denial of an ism called nationalism, right? But the distorted picture we carry from this moment, partly perpetrated by a movie I love. I still show it to my students. This is one of the concluding scenes of Lawrence of Arabia, that chaos reigned in Damascus after the war. Lawrence, and the Arabs make their way and get into Damascus, well, maybe a little bit behind the Australian troops who move in. They expel the Ottomans and fully expect the state that they thought they'd been promised by the British. They will, of course, learn that the British had made a deal with the French in something called the Sykes-Picot Agreement, right, and so on. But where the movie ends is with a picture of Anthony Quinn and Omar Sharif fighting with each other. Nobody knows how to get the water system running or the electrical plant running. There's a hospital with filth and wounded patients and no doctors to care for them. And we've lived with a picture a script out of movies like this and other popular media that, the Arabs couldn't get over their tribalism. They really couldn't make their nationalism work. There was something wrong with them that, that made them unable to be governed. And indeed, if you think about it, that played into the discourses of the men in Paris who wanted every good reason to justify moving in and taking the territory of the Arabs after the war in the form of the mandates, right? But there's another story, not about Lawrence, but after Lawrence, that I'm going to close with today a little bit. That will talk about, show, and suggest ways in which constitutional ideals endured from before and well after, but as a deferred dream. This is the Ottoman Parliament in 1908. All right, elected in earlier that year, and that's Tahrir Square. Okay. When I went to Tahrir Square, when I talked to Egyptians, they all had images and different stories about what was before Nasser, right, and a sort of constitutionalism that they enjoyed. What we've also seen, and what you talked about a little bit, and we'll talk about more, is the tragic schism in the revolutionary coalition. Depending on which side you're on, the betrayal of the Muslim Brothers of the more secular half, the capture by Sisi of a language and an inclusive politics against the very exclusive and rigid ideology of the Muslim Brothers. But what I want to talk about in my last, how many more minutes do I have? 5 minutes, is the actual casualty of Islamic liberalism, all right? If democracy could have worked in the Middle East, it would have had to be, I think, an indigenous form of democracy, one in which that was truly inclusive, one that was devised by those who, built the regimes, and not one imposed from without. and that in fact at Damascus in 1920 such a thing had happened. And here I'm going to show you. Just by contrast, in 1919, right after the war, amongst the many movements of peoples who looked to Woodrow Wilson, looked to Paris, for independence and to build a polity were the Egyptians in Cairo. This is a picture from their 1919 revolution. And important to see that you have the cross and the crescent on this. Imagining a society in which Muslims and Christians would be equal. All right? And that is the movement that drew so many people out into the streets. The same sort of thing happened at Damascus. Here's a nice picture of Faisal on Coronation Day in March 8, 1920. For those of you not totally familiar, I'll give you the short story and refer you to some reading if you want more detail. Right? But Faisal comes back from Paris. Wilson sends a commission to poll people in Greater Syria about what kind of government they want, in keeping with his idea of self-determination. And Faisal pulled together a Congress, handpicked many of the people for sure, but it was elected according to the old Ottoman system. And they came together, they met the Americans, and a bit to Faisal's displeasure, the Congress did not disperse itself. Amongst the people in the Congress was none other than Sheikh Mohammed Rashid Rida. He had been, until the end of the war in Cairo, publishing the most popular Islamic magazine in the Arab world, Al-Manar, meaning the lighthouse. Right? He's known to historians as sort of an intellectual history, as the student and heir to one of the great Islamic reformers of the late 19th century, Muhammad Abduh, who had become the Mufti of Egypt, but he himself was from Lebanon. And when he saw that Faisal was constituting a government over in Damascus, he decided to go back, considering Greater Syria to be, Lebanon to be part of Greater Syria. In fact, he gets elected from Tripoli, northern Lebanon, the city of Tripoli, into the Congress. Let's see if I can show you a picture. There he is up upper right-hand corner. All right. More interesting is that while in Cairo, he had helped found something called the Syrian Union Party. And it was a party that joined Muslims and Christians. They cut their ties to Sharif Hussein, Faisal's father, down in Mecca, and decided they would build a Syrian state in which Christians and Muslims would be equal. And if you read his magazine, right, you can see he, like others, are very concerned about the Lebanese. He's a Muslim in Lebanon, that the Maronite Church and the French are going to build a sectarian, exclusionary state, a Christian-looking state in his town, and that in his country, and then down in Palestine there will be a Jewish state. And what they decided to do, twofold. Okay, and I've been piecing this together and thinking about it, because, well, in the background at another time, but two things. One is he wants inclusion, and his norm is the old Ottoman constitutional norm. And the point of constitutions in the Ottoman era were to bring Muslims, Christians, Jews, and all the different nationalities together in one place and make that multicultural thing work. Right? The second was to please Paris. Right? Because at Paris, the occupation of the Arab territories was going to take the form of mandates, which were to be temporary periods of rule, not unlike some things we devise today, for peoples who don't know how to govern themselves. They're not quite modern yet, right? And they desperately wanted to prove they were modern enough. And they were going to build and construct a constitutional regime that looked like a European regime to prove their point. Okay? So they're very much looking to Europe, but they're also looking back into their own heritage. The interesting thing that they do here is they pass what probably could stand. And I'm going to pick my friend Nathan Brown's brains because he's the Mr. Constitutional expert in Washington, D.C. these days in my neighborhood. I think it's the most liberal, most democratic constitution in the Arab world for most of the 20th century. Okay? more democratic, more inclusive, with more freedoms guaranteed than most of the constitutions in the late 20th century. Riga played a central mediating role between two parties and two wings at the Congress. On one hand, you had Faisal's sort of elitist secularists who wanted a government that had no religion in it at all. They would have gone for a republic if Faisal weren't there. Right? On the other hand, there was a party in the Congress that were Islamic populists. They were very democratic in many ways, populist in that sense, right? That did not want to give over power to Faisal, who wanted sort of home local rule in the various provinces and wanted a strong legislature, and they got it. Whereas the constitutions coming before it and the constitutions imposed in the mandates all gave great power to the king, the legislature here had great power and much power over Faisal. Faisal was so angry he wanted to dissolve the Congress soon after his coronation in March 1920. And it was Riga who's quoted as going up to him saying, "You can't dissolve us. It was the Congress that created you. You are there only at our behest." He was much an advocate of popular sovereignty. He struck a compromise between the two wings, and so that the Congress, the Constitution they devised was called a parliamentary monarchy, in which the only thing Islamic about it was that the king had to be Muslim. That was his compromise point. He told the secularists, you can't have a total secular republic. People are used to having a caliph and a sultan and, Sharia law and all of that. You have to give them something. So we'll make sure the king is a Muslim. There is no Islam as a source of legislation in this constitution. There is no Islam as an official religion of the state. And instead, much language about the equality of religions, the freedom of belief, freedom of speech, and so on. Indeed, seats were reserved for the various minorities in the region, in Syria. They met here. They finally met in this. They had their own building in the center of Damascus, in Marches Square. 9 days after they ratified the Constitution, the French lined up their troops on the border of Lebanon, gave them an ultimatum, capitulate or we'll invade, and they invaded. Drida and Faisal fled for their lives, leaving Damascus in late July 1920, not to return. He tried for a while. This is a committee formed up at Geneva to oppose the mandate, but lost. And here's another file picture. Did a 180-degree turn, turned his back on the idea of secular government, and returned to something that he actually wrote during the war, and I'll end with this. He had predicted in 1918 in his magazine, saying, if the Europeans divide the Arab lands into mandates, they will send the message that right, justice, and freedom are intended only for Christians. He, like others in the Middle East, turned their backs on the emergent idea of international law, crimes against humanity, these kind of trials that were being set up, courts to try the Turkish leaders for the Armenian genocide and so on. And he inspired none other than Hassan al-Banna to found the Muslim Brotherhood. And the founding principle of the Muslim Brotherhood is that Islamic justice is different from Western justice. That is the legacy we live with today because of the occupation of Damascus, because of the imperialist politics of the Big Four at Paris, and because of the anger and humiliation of people who've been traumatized by war at being excluded from humanity. They were basically told at Paris in 1919, 1920, you are not full human beings, you do not deserve full rights under international law, you will become colonial people. A sad legacy, but one I hope, it is useful to ponder as a sort of deep mindset, a deep heritage of the war that underlies any project to knit back together societies that have been so sundered between a politics now of, I think the power of the Muslim Brotherhood was to say, we are fully human, we can include ourselves in our own society, and we do not have to play second fiddle, second citizen to the elitist, secular, colonial society that has come to rule over us and exclude us from our own country. Thanks so much. Are there any, I'm sorry, I'm going to leave enough time for questions and answers. I know there's another panel, but if you have any comments or questions, I'm happy to answer what I can right now.
We have time for a few questions, please, and then we're going to convene the panel.
Oh, no. Great.
Hi, I'm a evolution, and I greatly enjoyed your book. I was wondering if you could maybe describe the evolution of the circle of justice that you described in the Ottoman Empire. So maybe starting back all the way to when it was first described in the, I guess, 16th century.
Oh yeah, sure. More detail than I gave you in the book. I'm very impressed. But what particularly about it did you read? The origins of it, or the book?
I was particularly interested in the way that, I guess, what I'm curious about is, did this come top to bottom, or was it more that as the empire became weaker, and as, you know, there were more and more discontent, was this kind of a response to appease people and keep everything together, or were there genuine reformers at the top in the elite, or was it a combination of both?
And regarding the circle of justice?
Yes.
Or, okay. I guess what I tried to describe in the book was a kind of dialectic. Okay, there was on one hand, the Ottoman Turks were Turks. You know, they were very self-conscious that they were not heirs to the Prophet, right? They weren't, they did have a title faith, but they weren't really, right? And then what they could do is uphold the law and rule it, you know, justly as the people should expect them to. And so they looked at earlier tracts on governance and so on, right, particularly from the Persian and other sources, devised for themselves an ideal. All right, that is certain. On the other hand, they also faced many pressures from below, right, and that reform really comes out of, is more prompted by the pressures from below than anything else, right? The old circle of justice, the book talks about this sort of. You've studied early modern Europe, you know about the body politic. It's one of these kind of mental maps, if you will, right? That the queen or the king is the head, and the people are the limbs, and everybody plays their role, but you're all supposed to stay in your own place. So the circle of justice is very, very much an early modern model of justice, where everyone has interlocking responsibilities and duties toward one another. But heaven forbid that you should move out of your place. It's a very static model, right? What I argue in the book, and that differs from another book that recently came out on the Circle of Justice, right, is that the Ottoman elite abandoned that in the 19th century, right, in favor of liberal reforms that would open up the economy to market forces and so on. And that much of the history from that period has to be understood as the reaction of people who've been bereft, left by their state that no longer protects them. That instead is not very good at collecting taxes from them, right? And that constitutionalism, in a way, becomes the substitute. Is this, I don't know whether I'm answering the question you have, but, right, and then, so, which we articulate in a very different way, right? Relationship with rulers. So, yes?
Hi, my name is Karen Green. I'm a student here and a member of the EPIIC Colloquium.
Okay.
It seems like one of the great strengths of the Ottoman model, especially when talking about ruling over the Middle East as constituted today, is that it provided a great deal of local autonomy while still being contained within the centralized unit that was the Ottoman state. So what are some lessons that contemporary leaders could learn from that model, especially in places like Syria and Libya that seem to be in danger of splintering due to sectarian ties?
Oh boy. Well, I mean, it was built on a bit of hierarchy, right? You had to have nice patriarchs and tribal chiefs and landowners to police people. The Ottoman Empire foundered in attempting to transition to being a polity of equal citizens. So you can't directly transpose it to today. The cat is out of the bag, and people expect their equal rights, right? That's a great question. There's a historian up in Canada who wrote a book about the Ottoman Empire and the ways in which our thinking about it is so informed by European models of the nation state that we can't see it for what it was. By the 18th century, it had actually developed a pretty interesting federal system of government with a lot of what she calls the vernacular forms of governance, right, that could vary from one place to another. But that defeat at the hands of the Russians convinced the Ottoman elite that they had to build a state like a European state, and we've lost that vernacular about local political governance as a result. But I'm standing here telling you, I wish all of you would go into Middle Eastern history, that we really know so little. Much of the literature on the reform of the Middle East was written a couple generations ago. You all may have sort of studied modernization theory, and a bunch of assumptions made about what it takes to be a workable government, and among them being that you should have a pretty homogeneous citizenry, everybody should feel sort of the same, you shouldn't have clumps of communities of different cultures, But there was a whole movement about multicultural citizenship led by sociologists in Canada who were trying to incorporate Eskimos, written by some Arabs and Israelis, trying to rethink out of the box, what do we do with this thing. And I think we could look back and learn some real lessons about ways in which being multicultural was not a death sentence. But by the time you get to World War I, the Austrians, the Ottomans, the Russians all saw, were convinced they saw the writing on the wall and that they, governed unworkable polities. Only the communists would take up the task again in a new way, of course. So I don't know that we know enough about it to extract any specific lessons, except to perhaps ask ourselves, as a country that is itself, by definition, multicultural, whether it's worth a second look, whether the sick man of Europe really was all that sick, or whether it was, as I implied in my talk, outside forces that undercut political systems more than internal decay. Yes?
This will be the last question.
Thank you, ma'am. I'm Midshipman Jordan Moya from the United States Naval Academy. You mentioned in your speech that there was this fear amongst the Arabs that when the West came in, it would champion Christianity, these Christian colonies, and push out Islam. But we have the circumstance that you touched upon where we have the Balfour Declaration that recognized the Jews as having a rightful place in the Middle East. Can you describe a bit more in depth how that may have contributed to the Arab revolt?
The Balfour Declaration? The Balfour Declaration actually comes after the Arab revolt starts. So, you mean?
Or Arab resentment, rather.
Oh.
Towards the West.
Two things about it, okay? I mean, on one hand, in the book, I kind of emphasize normalized Zionism, right? Because Jews, like everybody else, thought they were slated for annihilation, right? And in that sense, they were in good company as they migrated to the Middle East. But there's a really good book I like a lot, recently written by Abigail Jacobson. She got her PhD at Chicago, and she's at MIT, right here. You got her. Looking at how life in Jerusalem changed after Allenby came in. And The book, in its own way, suggests, I wouldn't call it an argument, but suggests that another route, another way that history might have proceeded was lost with the Balfour Declaration, because with it came the kind of high-handed, top-down kind of imperial politics, right? Chaim Weizmann comes in, you know, he's got the Zionist Commission, he gets a foot in the door with Allenby and his successors, they impose a vision of Yishuv and a community from the outside. Whereas there were Sephardic Jews who were living in Jerusalem, who were Zionist, who were interested in learning Hebrew, but who were also neighbors of the Arabs in the city, and had advocated a very different vision of how they might relate to the Arabs going forward. But their voices get silenced as a result. So one of the takeaways is to think about the way in which it was done, right? That much of the tragedy of Paris and the tragedy of the way in which the Balfour Declaration came about and the issue was planted after the war is that it did not heed the Wilsonian ideal of, you know, people choosing their own self-determination and so on, but rather was imposed from without and was seen as therefore oppressive and illegitimate. So that, as I described in the book, you know, the Arabs had no other script. If the, you know, European powers were played in the 19th century script of, you know, secret deals and the goodwill of the great powers as opposed to the rights of peoples around the world, the Arabs would play to the Wilsonian script, but you saw what happened to the League of Nations in this country and to Wilson himself, and you know, that tactic didn't get them very far. They're now condemned by most historians. I expect once book reviews come out, there'll be a bit of criticism of that part of my book, and that I give credence to the Arab leaders who did go up to London and try to appeal on the basis of their rights as a people against you know, certain provisions of the mandate. But Churchill would never talk to them. They were shut out, right? And there are those who, in retrospect, think they should have picked up guns right away. You know, it's neither here nor there. They wouldn't have won. But anyway, sorry, I can't be. I hope I've answered your question now.